Hi, everyone. You are tuning in to Farming Fast and Slow. And just a little bit of housekeeping to start off. This is going to be recorded, so we're going to put it into YouTube later. We will be talking for about a half an hour and are going to invite your questions. And so please participate in the discussion. And with that, I really want to kind of kick off the show. My guest this week is Keith Paustian, distinguished professor at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, and longtime member, if not originator of the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory, which was really groundbreaking for decades in terms of developing models to understand soil carbon dynamics, and then ultimately is continued to be on the forefront of creating tools around decision support. And I had this funny thought, Keith. I was thinking back for whatever reason to the summer. I had applied to go to school at UC Davis, and they accepted me. And then before going to school, we had to pick a major. And so they offered this kind of list of all the various majors you had. And I remember that one of the choices was soil science. And like literally, it's etched in my memory that my friends and I laughed at how absurd it would have been if we checked the box that said soil science. And I think I ended up checking the box that said fermentation science. But I sort of had this idea that nobody like grows up wanting to be a soil scientist, but a lot of us discover soil science and fall in love with it and never leave like this intrigue. And I'm curious, when did you become a self-identified soil scientist? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. First, I would kind of disavow that I was one of the originators of the Natural Resource Ecology Lab. Not quite that old, but
well, you're older than me, so I assume anything that
I know that. Yeah, and I think it's I don't know. I would guess there's probably been more than one student who was interested in fermentation and fermentation products in particular, who then later gravitated towards soil science at some point for a career when they decided they wanted to figure out how the grapes or the barley grew actually, or the potatoes or whatever it might be.
That's exactly how it happened.
But no, I think I started off really, I always knew I wanted to kind of work in natural resources in some way. And I started off originally as being interested in forestry, and I still am in that sense, and I've done quite a bit of work in forest ecosystems. But I don't know, when I was doing my master's degree, I took a number of soil science courses, and I was just, I think, fascinated by partly by the complexity. If you think of it, it's a whole universe, right? And what do you study when you study soil science? Well, you study soil chemistry and soil biology and microbiology and ecology and physics. So in a sense, it's like its own little universe, and all the sciences are there. And if you're studying soil science, then it's really integrative, and it's it's holistic. And so I think those are the kinds of things that appealed to me, as a discipline. And so I kind of, moved into that direction, and I've, certainly been it's been a great career I've had, very satisfying. It's I think a wonderful field to work in.
And I mean, I fell in love around just this whole, I don't know, ethos around cycles, in coupled cycles, where the cow eats the grass, defecates, bunch of bugs eat it, becomes mineralized, the roots grab it, and becomes more grass, and understanding how dynamic it is and all these processes get coupled. And I know we're going to get into that in just a couple minutes. I know you prepared a presentation. I had sort of envisioned, just to set the context for this program, this idea of, carbon farming for the new millennium. And, walking in, to this random presentation off the street, one might wonder, why are we even talking about carbon? Why, if we're talking about carbon, are we talking about soil carbon? I wonder if you can, before we go directly to the presentation, localize us to where is this discussion in the starting in the first place?
Yeah, big picture, I guess, is, if you think about it, we're a land dwelling species, and and somewhere 10,000 years ago or more, we changed our habits from being hunter gatherers to agriculture, and ever since, that's been, the foundation of our cultures and civilizations have been, in a sense, built on the soil. And again, it's so soils are fundamental to who we are, but of course for the rest of the living entities on the planet. And actually, we talk about land, but of course the hydrosphere and terrestrial landscapes are intimately associated in terms of nutrient transfers and cycling. And so it's all part of that global ecosystem, if you will, or biosphere. And so soils are fundamental to that, and they're fundamental to to humanity, and how we persist or not. And so I think that's big picture why soils matter. And I think most people, if they stop and think about it, it's yeah, we all recognize that, but we often don't necessarily look too much beyond that and look into how soils really touch our daily lives and are associated with I think our biggest global challenges, in a sense, that we need to deal with. So and that's what hopefully we'll get into, that a little bit of that today. And I think well, that's probably enough said for now, but
Yeah, no, and you're reminding me, there's I don't know how I ended up with this book. I think the writer was F.H. King, is USDA scientist, turn of the century, who went to China, wrote this book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, about this question: how did you have a civilization that lasted 4,000 years? And the premise was that you needed to sustain the soil for 4,000 years in order for that to happen. And so, soils, and in particular, their nutrient and organic matter status is, being maintained. So that, I feel like that's been a view of soils that we've had, let's say for a century. And now we've got this other kind of growing awareness around the carbon cycle that affects, our long-term climate change. And then, gosh, what are we going to be doing about the climate to deal with things? And always there's been kind of an emphasis on reduced emissions. And then more recently, I think there's been more serious discussion about sort of active sequestration as a formal strategy for dealing with climate change. And a big sort of piece of that and you've played a big role in sort of, you know, quantifying it and sensitizing people to it, is the amount of carbon that could be stored in soils. And therefore, this agricultural soil carbon becomes part of a climate solution. And so I wonder if that's a good introduction to you presenting some of the background that you brought.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Should I just go ahead and kind of launch into it then?
Yeah, maybe let's start there. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. Hang on just a second. Let me do the screen share business and we'll get everything kind of set up, hopefully.
Nice. I see it.
Okay, let me just get the get some of this stuff going. What happened? Okay, presentation mode. And now let me swap this.
Beautiful.
Okay, does that look all right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Adam, for the opportunity to come and talk about this. So, and I want to really start off with, as we kind of alluded to in our introductory comments, is really looking at soils and soil organic matter and carbon farming, if you will, from the standpoint of a couple of really what I would call global challenges that are paramount to, you know, to the times that we're living in. And the first global challenge really deals with soil degradation, food security, the resilience of our agroecosystems to things like climate perturbation, et cetera. And you know, this map kind of, you know, illustrates the fact that that soil degradation is really widespread. It occurs, you know, throughout the world, and it's a, you know, a serious issue that we need to deal with. And soils are, you know, are fundamental to that. Uh, and and in a sense, if we look at, okay, we want to reverse, stop soil degradation. We want to improve the health of our soils. And really, the point about this with respect to organic matter is that organic matter is in many ways kind of the key indicator, or the key, you know, the nexus, if you will, for really healthy soils and soil function. So if you think of all the attributes that are important in terms of soil fertility, in terms of the soil water balance and infiltration, and how much water the soil can hold, and detoxification, soil biodiversity, you know, the physical properties of the soil, turns out that organic matter is really a strong control and an essential part of that. So if we talk about improving soils, about reversing soil degradation, a big part of it in many areas, in most areas, is really, okay, we need to figure out how to manage to increase the organic matter, enhance the organic matter in soils. The second global challenge is, you know, not surprisingly, climate change, and you kind of alluded to that before. And it's, you know, it's ongoing. We know it, we understand it pretty well. We have a good idea of what's likely to happen unless we change our, you know, our practices pretty dramatically. And so here over on the right hand side, and these are the typical kinds of diagrams you see in the IPCC assessments and things like this. And this basically, this top diagram on the right shows annual emissions, and here we are somewhere on the order of, I can't remember exactly if it's near 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalents in terms of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, we've got different futures depending on how we manage our economy. If we stay on a business as usual, we look on this red line, and that's a very bad place we don't want to go to. If we want to, you know, meet the objectives of the Paris Accords that I think everyone's probably heard about, we need to get on this trajectory, this blue trajectory, where emissions are essentially, you know, reducing now and continue to reduce and reach essentially zero, you know, somewhere before the end of the century. And that would take us to, you know, keep us below this 2-degree limit that is at least most people think is feasible, but it's going to be difficult to get there. So we need to manage, greenhouse gas emissions. And as you mentioned, I guess there's certainly the importance of reducing in particular, fossil fuel emissions, but other greenhouse gas emissions from all the different human activities. And this is kind of a simplified diagram of those emission pathways that I showed before. And this is out of this recent National Academy's report on negative emissions that came out a couple years ago. And if you look at, so this kind of business as usual, this is emissions if they just, continue, and then eventually they start to peak out and reduce as we begin to decarbonize the economy. But we really need to be on this red line. This red trajectory takes us, to where we want to be in terms of this below 2 degrees scenario. And so in order to do that, first of all, we've got to have a huge commitment to reduction of CO2 emissions, to this abatement technologies and everything that entails in terms of decarbonizing our economy. But we've also got other greenhouse gases that are more difficult to reduce. And we've got some fossil CO2 emissions, things like air transport, and that are going to be difficult to entirely eliminate. So the point of this graph is to say, if we want to be on this red trajectory, then we need to reduce all of these greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from fossil fuels, but we also need to actively take up CO2 that we've already emitted that's in the atmosphere now, so that the net trajectory, this red line, is made up of both mitigation, reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but also active uptake, or so-called negative emissions, okay? So we've got to do both. That's essentially the message here. And there are a whole different set of options that are available. Again, this is from this National Academy's report. And so you can look at engineering methods that involve this direct air capture and so-called BECCS, the biomass energy and carbon capture and storage, with sequestration of supercritical CO2 in geologic formations, enhanced mineralization, et cetera. But also you've got over here, you've got soil carbon. So we can, the question is then, can we manage our soils so that they gain carbon and store that carbon in the form of organic matter? And most folks don't necessarily appreciate that actually of our terrestrial, biotic stocks, or what's actively cycling, you've got carbon in the atmosphere, you've got carbon in the vegetation, and you've got carbon in the soil. And if you even just take this carbon that is stored in the top 1 meter of soil globally, it's actually more carbon there than is present in all the vegetation and in the atmosphere combined. So it's a huge amount of carbon that is in the soil in the form of soil organic matter. And and the question is then, can we increase that storage, which will both take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and contribute to this negative emissions, but it will also at the same time enhance our soil health and soil function.
What's not to like?
Yeah, what's not to like? Yeah, mom and apple pie. How do we do that? Okay, and I'll again go off of this National Academy's report, which kind of said there's 2 broad categories of things that we can do. So we can do what I'll call best management practices. These are sort of existing conservation management practices that are out there, they're being practiced, but in a lot of cases they haven't been adopted that widely. And so one of the things we can do is to encourage the much more wide adoption of these conservation practices in our agricultural systems. The other thing we can do is we can think about what I'll call frontier technologies. And so these are technologies that are either in early stage of development or there's still some significant technical or economic constraints to their widespread adoption, but they could be technologies that we could bring on stream in the next few decades that would really potentially make a huge difference in this carbon sequestration capability. So if we want to look at existing, these best management technologies that are really just application of conservation techniques that are out there that are being practiced now, but we've got things like, okay, we've got annual crop, which in a lot of cases have been where we till the soil. We have a summer crop like corn or soybeans on the soil for 3 or 4 months a year, and the rest of the time the soil is bare. There's no vegetation on it. There's no photosynthesis going on. There's no carbon capture. Well, what if we change those to look at reducing the amount of soil disturbance, no-till, strip-till, things like this, cover crops, maybe mixing in annuals with perennials. The idea of, you know, getting a plant on the ground, being there, taking up carbon, covering the soil. I think that's a basic principle. And those kinds of practices are possible, and they can be much more widely adopted on our agricultural, our cropland land areas. And then you can look at also at pastures, and can we have improved grazing systems? Can we, on areas where we've got cropland that's maybe not very sustainable, can we restore that back to grasslands or forestry, agroforestry, restoring peatlands? There's a whole lot of things that we can do, that we know how to do, that can be done you know, much more ubiquitously in our agricultural landscapes. Ideas of these perennial technologies, or sorry, frontier technologies, are things like, you know, are there perennial grains that could be deployed instead of annual crops? And we know perennials have much more carbon below ground in terms of roots, and they have other attributes. And folks at the Land Institute and now at several universities have been working on the idea of perennializing certain grain and oilseed crops and things like this. So those are, you know, early technologies. They're not proven. They're not proven in the sense that they can be necessarily adopted right now on millions of acres of land. But, you know, as research and development goes in, then those things become, you know, possible options. We can also look at can we enhance the root characteristics of some of our annual plants? Can we, and folks at the Salk Institute, for example, are looking at, hey, if we had roots that had a higher suberin content, so the same molecule that's in cork, you know, does that mean that the roots could persist for a longer period of time in soils? Or can we have deeper, more abundant roots with some of our annual crops, so they become a little bit more like perennial crops, but they're still annuals, but they're adding more carbon to the soil, they're adding it deeper, organic amendments. There's, you know, there are different things that we can imagine that will be possible, that also require more, you know, research and development, but they're sort of out there, and they're promising technologies. Okay, so what does this mean if we both are going to take our conventional conservation practices and we're going to try to apply those more broadly, you know? And this is really looking at some of these estimates that have been made over the year in terms of the technical potential. So what's the, you know, not thinking initially about economics and policy, but let's just look at, you know, how much could we increase soil carbon contents if we, first of all, practiced conservation practices more or less ubiquitously. And there's a number of these, you know, these green estimates here, and these bars indicate sort of upper and lower limits to the extent that they were given in the, you know, in the publication. You can see that in most cases, where people are looking broadly at these green bars, there's several authors who have said, hey, somewhere on the order of 2 to 5, you know, billion tons of CO2 equivalents per year over, you know, 2 or 3 decades period might be possible if we sort of broadly practice these kinds of of conservation practices. So if you went back to that National Academies diagram, that that doesn't solve the problem, but it contributes to it. If we're looking at having carbon removal on the order of 10 to 15 billion tons, by the end of the century or something of that order, maybe soils could contribute something 25% of it. So it's not
it's significant. That's what I'm always impressed by, is it plays a major role in that solution.
And maybe if we look at these, we had a paper a few years ago, I guess, that also took a first crack at what if we added in frontier technologies. And this is admittedly speculative, because by definition, those aren't technologies that are out there and we don't have a lot of data on them. But a reasonable approximation is, we might be able to even double that amount. So I guess the bottom line of this is that the biologic potential, if you will, this technical potential is there. Whether or not it occurs, of course, is going to matter about do we have the economic incentives, do we have the policies and the social systems that would encourage that to happen. And if we don't have that, then obviously it's not going to happen. But there are some ways that I think that are emerging now, where there's a number of different ways in which ag producers can be incentivized. And there's things, whether it's government subsidies, a lot of the stuff that USDA and the Natural Resource Conservation Service does in terms of EQIP and conservation programs, et cetera. Those are really predicated on trying to encourage adoption of some of these conservation practices. And we've also got emerging carbon markets. Can farmers and ranchers, in effect, still produce food and fiber, but can they also get compensation for ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration, for example? So that's something that's going on now. And increasingly, a number of companies that are in the agricultural space are interested in promoting sustainable supply chains. And so they're looking at, hey, are we going to reward farmers, encourage farmers to lower the carbon footprint of our products? And ultimately, if you look at virtually any agricultural product, whether it's food, it's maybe a gallon of ice cream, or it's a wool sweater, if it comes from material that originated on the land, it turns out that if you look at with a full life cycle analysis of what's the carbon footprint, if you will, of that product at the end of the day when the consumer buys it, and it turns out that probably somewhere on the order of 60, 70, maybe even 80% of the carbon footprint is actually associated with the emissions, within the farm gate, if you will. And so if companies want to reduce their overall carbon footprint for their product, the place to look is within the farm gate, and getting farmers to adopt practices that could dramatically reduce those emissions. So, these are all ways that we can use to try to go in that direction. But in order to do these policies, these market-based solutions, really a critical part of it, and the part that I'm certainly working on is really about metrics. We've got to be able to quantify what's happening, and it's hard. You want an ideal system. You want to be able to be locally sourced, because different farms are different, and soils are different, and climates are different. So we can't assess what's going to happen with a particular practice is not going to be the same everywhere. We've got to have systems that are unbiased, where we're going to have uncertainty. And pretty high uncertainty in a lot of cases, but it's the most important thing there is knowing what the uncertainty is. But we've also got to have things that are cost effective, that can be applied without the cost of the measurement, and the quantification is not greater than the overall benefit. And it's got to be easy to use. And this isn't easy, because if we look at soil carbon, if we look particularly at gas fluxes, things like nitrous oxide, methane, those are dispersed across the landscape. They're non-point source emissions, and they're varying in space and time. there's a whole lot of rates that are controlling the processes. And yeah, we can do direct measurements, but for the most part, these require really specialized equipment and training that are more conducive in a research environment. So I would maintain that we can't, go out and measure accurately and inexpensively on every farmer's field what their carbon changes are, or certainly what their N2O emissions are, something like that. And so we have to keep, the measurement part needs to be more strategic, and I would say more devoted to, in particular, the research environment, experimental. And so the thing that my group is really working on is how do we develop decision support tools and quantification tools that will support the quantification on farm of these, of carbon and greenhouse gases. And just want to briefly talk about a couple of the tools. One on the left-hand side here is called CommonFarm, which is really a full greenhouse gas and carbon inventory and projection system that's really designed for the farm scale. And then there's another tool, which is a kind of a derivative of that, which gives kind of regional averages, looking at specific conservation practices. So just kind of walk through here really quickly. The first thing to point out is these tools are really designed to look at all the emission sources and different gases that are involved. And that's the thing about agriculture. And when you start talking about greenhouse gases and carbon inventories and things like this, it's by far the most complex of any of the major systems. For quantifying greenhouse gases from car emissions or something like this is kind of relatively simple to some degree. It's much more complex in these biotic emissions in the managed ecosystems. And so if we want to understand how our land use systems affect so carbon, but also net greenhouse gas emissions, we need to take that holistic approach. And the COMET tools then grew out of an effort that USDA started a number of years ago to basically develop an entity scale set of methods. So you've got the greenhouse gas inventories that occur, at the national scale for IPCC reporting and things like this. But this was to say, okay, what are some methods? What are some protocols that can be used at the individual farm scale? And so this blue book here, what we call the blue book, came out in 2014, and it is really a compendium. It's a document that recommends methods that cover all these emissions and gases and stuff. So essentially, the CommonFarm tool is a way in which those methods are put into an online web tool that anyone can use. They can use it for free. That essentially implements those methods.
Is
and
it
just
you would implement it for yourself?
Yeah, a farmer could do it, a crop consultant could do it, or we've got students and all kinds of other folks can do it. So it's designed specifically that non-specialists can use the technology. They have to know where their farm is. They have to know how they manage it. But that's the primary needs they have. And I'll go into just a real brief kind of an overview of how it works here in a second. Mm-hmm. But again, so CommonFarm, the way it's designed is to say, okay, you can put in information about your baseline. What are you doing now? And so you put in information about your management at the field scale, around your farm, also your livestock, however you're managing your systems. And then you can choose between different kinds of conservation practices that you have either already implemented, and so you want to use the tool as a kind of an inventory of how that has changed, or also you can use it for a projection to say, what if I were to change my management in such a way, what might some of the benefits be? So this really entails kind of using a lot of details about the the farm management, but also the location and the soil types and the weather and all this kind of stuff. So it's something that is pretty detailed. The Comet Planner tool is one which is kind of built off of CommonFarm, but it's really designed as to give a first approximation. So we call it a four-click tool. So you would go in and you would say, here's my state and county, and I want to look at this type of land use system, and it assumes essentially a typical baseline, if you will, or what, what's the likely circumstances there now on the land, and then pick from a set of conservation practices that had been defined by USDA and estimate what the practice benefit is.
I think there's something in this kind of previous slide that is really fascinating for me, which is around like the yield gaps analysis, where knowing that there's some other person in this same, county, same soil, same weather, same variety, that nevertheless got 20% more yield, sort of, it's possible to know what is achievable.
Yeah.
And I think what this provides is also a notion of, well, what can I realistically hope for? Like, what's a stretch goal? What is, reasonable near-term goal?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You could certainly use these kind of tools for, for benchmarking of, what's the, what do we think current practices are yielding, and what are the possibilities for improvement there? So I think that's certainly a great example of the use. How this looks to the user. So I guess this will, I don't have time and don't want to spend a lot of time to lead folks through, but you can, if you just Google CommonFarm, it comes up, you can go in, you can use it for free, you can play around. There's lots of YouTube videos and other things that kind of show you how to use it. And Comet Planner is even easier to use. So it's certainly, I don't think there's a huge barrier for folks to go in and play around. We've also got a help desk, and folks can contact us for trainings and different things like this. But when you go into CommonFarm, you're really bringing up a platform. So it's got a web interface that takes you through, and you can put in your management of your croplands and grazing, your livestock, your energy use, agroforestry, just about any kind of managed agro-ecosystem that you want to think about. And we've got a couple of ways. I don't really have time to show now, but you can go in and you can sort of accept kind of regionally relevant defaults, so that you can go in and sort of set up a set of scenarios pretty quickly. But you can also go in and put in the management exactly on your field. And you can see over here on the left hand side, one of the in the interface, once you go in and you designate a particular field, it locates that, calculates the area, the underlying soils map. So this is USDA's Surgo soils, the finest resolution soil maps that are publicly available. And so the calculations that are done are done for all the soil types within the field, using the information about the field management. So that kind of leads me to the fact that there's a lot of back-end data that are in this system in terms of soil maps and climate and remote sensing and historical land management and defaults and different things like that. And those all feed into essentially what we call a calculations module. And so within that module, we have a whole lot of different models, depending on what the source category is, depending on what the gas is, et cetera. Some of those are empirical models. We also host a dynamic process-based model called the DayCent model, which is used in both for research. It's used in the national inventory for U.S. greenhouse gas accounting. So this simulation model runs within this system as well. So this whole platform then is what allows you to come up with estimates of greenhouse gases, of carbon stock changes, over time on your operation, and looking at what kind of alternative management you might want to
I have a I have a question. Actually, a question came in, and so I'm gonna uh, pose it to you. Which here you're showing models that use kind of data as boundary conditions. Maybe it's using weather, maybe it's using the Surgo soils.
Right, right.
There's some data entering into it, but then particular people have specific pieces of land, and outside of the modeled carbon sequestration, they want to collect soil carbon measurements.
Yeah.
Where does the kind of direct measurement fit in so that growers can know, like, is my carbon going in the right direction? Are there best practices for measurement part of the blue book?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. There are, there are different protocols for soil carbon measurement. I'm trying to recall if I'm not sure if there's guidance for direct measurement of fluxes and carbon stocks in the blue book itself. Part of it is, and certainly, folks that can do and want to do measurements should definitely be encouraged to do that. There are ways to do it that are, that lead to reliable results. I would say that one of the challenges is that farmers are very used to doing measurement for nutrient nutrient applications, things like spring nitrate tests, and you kind of walk across the field and you use an oak field core or something like this, and maybe take a bunch of samples in a transect across the field and put, and then composite those and send them off to a lab, and then you come back and you get an estimate of, well, here's your nitrate your pre-plant nitrate concentrations or something like that, or other kinds of soil
Sure.
soil nutrient testing, and those work quite well. I would say that there are some issues with soil carbon measurement that folks need to be cognizant of in terms of the relative, if you're really interested in soil carbon change over time, right? And to detect that change against the background amounts of carbon usually means that, for one thing, you need to look at measurements taken over 5 or 8 or 10 years duration, so that the change that's occurring annually has sufficient time to be detectable against the background soil stocks that are already there. And there's also a lot of spatial variability, and so you can definitely measure soil carbon stock changes. To do it well requires that you do a lot of sampling, and typically, and it's not cheap. So if you're going to do it on all of your fields as a routine basis, that becomes a kind of an impediment to broad.
Principle, though, do measurements reduce the uncertainty?
Yeah, for sure. No, they would. They would if you do the right kind of measurements and enough measurements on your land. You could, there's no question that directly measuring what's happening is going to, at a particular location, is superior to a model estimate, a model-based estimate, right? But I would also, one of the things that's really important to point out is there's a tremendous amount of detailed measurements that have gone into the development, the testing, the parameterization, the validation of these kind of biophysical models that or process-based models that are being used in systems like this in our thing. So, it's not the absence of measurement by any means. The soil measurements are a crucial part of it. Absolutely.
I did get another question related to the Haney soil health test. Do you provide kind of model output that would be correlated with such a test, or?
That's that's a good question. I don't know that usually those are based on soil samples that are analyzed, and then you I'm not that familiar with the Haney test in particular, but a lot of the soil quality tests or soil health tests involve looking at a whole bunch of different parameters, in terms of pH and organic matter content and nutrients and water holding capacity. I'm not quite sure of what all goes into those, but and certainly that there are many more attributes of soil health that one might be interested in than that aren't dealt with in the CommonFarm system. So
No doubt.
our focus is really on carbon, on greenhouse gases. We do have other outputs that include, water quality and water use, and we've been working with the Soil Health Institute to start to build an estimate for some soil health metrics that could be derived from knowledge about the changes in organic matter, the changes in land use and the soil type that one is on, and different things like this. But those are, so those kind of developments are
And then,
still kind of
interesting point. It may be focused as far as carbon as relates to the soil, and yet it's quite a bit more comprehensive when it's thinking about the whole enterprise greenhouse gas budget. Thinking about diesel emissions, NOx emissions. So in that sense, it's sort of more comprehensive than many other tools.
Yeah, I think I think that's true. I think at the same time, there's things that we can, continue to build out on. And just, I guess, finally, so, and we're, this is an ongoing process, and we're, constantly working on improvements and changes. But, we're working with a whole number of different stakeholders. Obviously, a lot of the work that we were originally, tasked to do was support USDA in their programs and conservation planning, et cetera. And USDA is still really a key stakeholder, but we're increasingly working with a number of state governments that are interested in healthy soils initiatives and things like this. We've worked a lot in the state of California, and in fact, the Comet Planner tool I talked about before was really something that came out of working with California, where they wanted a simple tool that they could use for folks that were participating in their Healthy Soils program. And so that is where really the Comet Planner came out of. We worked with a number of companies and stuff that are interested in sustainable supply chains, also carbon finance, NGOs. We're at a university, so we have students either using it for classroom applications or projects, etc. So just to kind of, I guess I'll give my final sort of soapbox points here about the significance of this. And really, I think that to me at the top level, it's kind of like agriculture really has, of course, it's been fundamental to human society, again, over 10,000 years, right? But I think it potentially has, a lot to do with going forward, not only in terms of continuing to be our major provisioning activity, if you will, but also something that we can use to help, stabilize climate and solve some of those problems. But in order to do that, there's no question, future agriculture needs to be fundamentally different from what it looks like now in terms of its ecological function. And I think, people that say, well, it's really not going to do very much. Well, if we don't change agriculture very much in terms of how it's structured and how, and how it's designed, then no, it's not going to impact or come with great changes. But there are opportunities to change the look of and the performance of our ag systems, and not only will it have an impact on, you know, on the carbon and greenhouse gases, but there's this tie-in to all the other things about soil health, whether in water quality. It's all tied together. So I think there's tremendous possibility there. But, you know, that's not going to just happen on its own. It's going to need to be part of, we're going to need effective technologies that need to inform farmers, you know, give them the opportunity to figure out how to de-risk transitioning to these kinds of systems, and incentivizing, you know, where that's needed. And I think the part that researchers, folks like myself and others in, you know, in academia and government, and but even more broadly, you know, the NGOs and other places, is really to continue to improve this, you know, science-based measurement, monitoring, verification. Because if we, you know, if we have a good idea of how our new systems are performing, we can, you know, adjust those, continue to improve them. We've got to have the science-based metrics to do so. So I'll close with that maybe, and stop sharing and go back to.
Yeah, I wonder, it's a perfect place to sort of introduce the discussion, and we running a little bit over, but it's a really compelling talk, and we have a couple questions waiting up. But I am sort of struck by, on the one hand, you present this kind of win-win situation where, you know, soil carbon is good for soil health. That gives plants, you know, better resistance against all kinds of diseases. You know, everything is wonderful about it. And yet, you know, once the market is involved, then we kind of trip over ourselves around all this kind of monitoring and verification stuff, because there's money at stake. And I guess suddenly, if someone is going to be compensated, then, or if there's a transaction, then there has to be proof, and then there's like liability for cheating. What's your current sense about how much there needs to be incentives in order for us to transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, one of the issues here also, when we're looking at carbon as a removal strategy, a really important part of it has got to be that having, you know, that as you build up your soil carbon, that has to be, you know, that has to be more valuable to keep it where it is than to re-emit it. And one of the problems, of course, is organic matter is, in a sense, a resource, and it's your bank account, right? And so if you want to liquidate your bank account, and this is what we did back in the days of the prairie expansion, right?
The West
Farmers came out, and there were organic matter rich soils that were under prairie. The prairie was converted to crop yields, and there was so much organic nitrogen associated with that organic matter that you could essentially farm, didn't have to add fertilizer, and for several years you could grow a good crop living off of the stored nitrogen that was in that organic matter. But as a consequence of that, of course, the organic matter depleted over time, and eventually the fertility gave out. Okay, then if farmers moved farther west and left the depleted lands, there's some great, you know, you can, Justus von Liebig writes about this in the, you know, in the 1800s in the, you know, in Virginia and some of the eastern, you know, states at the time, about sort of this kind of, you know, mining out of fertility. But I think now, you know, we can't expand really, certainly in this country, and I think for lots of other reasons, you know, we don't want to convert new ecosystems to agriculture in order to mine out the nutrients. So we've got to have systems that, where the farmer, it makes sense for them to build up and then maintain that organic matter. And I think in many cases it is, because it becomes, you know, it does support resilience. It supports productivity and fertility. Uh, and so I think, we need to look at systems that can do that. The problem with a lot of farmers, though, I think one of the things, there are impediments. When you're in farming, it's a risky business, and in a sense, there's always there's always some inertia to change. There's risk in changing, even if you're doing practices that are suboptimal. There's an element of risk. So we need to inform. We need to, I think, incentivize the transition, and then I think we want to, develop systems that once you transition into, and that new system becomes established, that hey, this system performs better, and why, and I'm not gonna take it out again. I'm not gonna go back to the old practices.
That makes sense, that there's kind of an activation energy,
Yeah.
and that could be, a knowledge support, not, simply financial.
Yeah, could be both. Yeah.
That's the, the obstacle of, let's say, why do you see such a limited adoption of cover crops and no-till or other phenomena? There's two questions I'd like to field from the audience before we wrap. And they're totally different. One is, I love it when someone kind of pokes at us North American soil scientists and says, but what about African and Latin American soils, and agricultural systems, which are obviously so different? And the other question is there actually a carbon market that can fund farm-based sequestration? So,
well, the first one, then, I think, and I would argue that in, if you will, in developing countries, or in the tropics, in Latin America and Africa, there are certainly challenges there. There are areas that are more subject to soil degradation and soil health issues probably there. But yeah, I think that there, encouraging and enabling farmers to move to more sustainable, to regenerative practices, if you will, the carbon farming is even more important there, because their availability of purchased inputs is much lower, and so farmers there need to base their management principles closer, if you will. Arguably, I think we need to do it everywhere, but they really need to be based on sort of the ecological principles. And so I think there's, it's imperative that these kind of techniques are even more broadly introduced to and incentivized in developing countries. And some of that's, there are some real success stories out there that are occurring, and maybe you can have that as one of your next
I mean, for me, the ultimate story is the Terra Preta soils that kind of predate our modern era, and you see evidence of just intense humification of these soils in the Amazon that people used to think were like all but infertile. So we know it's possible. And then just a closer on, like, what's the state of the market? Can people like?
Well, there are, I think there are, within some of the greenhouse gas registries, like the Climate Action Reserve, the Vera that has the VCS registry. There have been for a number of years a few projects that have been that are essentially voluntary carbon market systems, and some farmers are getting compensations there. One of the difficulties it's been very expensive, and part of it has to do with, again, the measurement and verification and reporting requirements are barriers, if you will, to maybe more widespread development of those kind of markets. There are some folks, Nori, for example, is a startup that is using block.
My sound went blank.
I think that was on my side. Sorry about that. Yeah. So Nori is working on, and some other folks are working on trying to set up carbon markets that will be able to funnel a higher amount of the proceeds, if you will, to the higher percentage to the growers by having lower transaction costs for setting up projects. You know, and then in terms of, I think one of the things that's happening there is, you know, increasing interest for carbon offset purchases or carbon reduction purchases on the part of companies, for example, that have set out carbon neutrality or carbon negative kinds of goals, some of the big tech companies, for example. So I think it's still early days, and there is, I think, a lot of the, if you will, the investor community that's looking at carbon is still asking questions, you know, what makes sense for our companies to invest in. So I think it's early to tell, but, you know, there's certainly, I think, things happening there, and there's
I have to imagine at some level it's consumer desire to buy kind of ethical, sustainable, you know, whatever is your personal passion, and it could be, you know, oriented around soil health or climate. If you're willing to put your money where your mouth is and buy products that espouse these values, then that drives the whole ecosystem that would allow for, you know, payments to farmers and whatnot.
yeah, I think that can have a part of it. And there are, you know, there are folks that are looking at, you know, the sustainable, you know, restaurants. Anthony Mint, for example, out in the Bay Area is you know, working on, you know, developing, you know, low carbon, you know, eating experiences and restaurant menus and things like this, so that folks can choose to, you know, you know, contribute to climate change mitigation through their, you know, consuming habits, and, you know, both in the grocery store, maybe in restaurants, et cetera. And so I think there's, you know, there's a lot happening now. It's kind of early to know exactly how it all is going to evolve, but
Yeah, I love it. And it's I don't know, one of those things where it's sort of soil health really, as kind of trying to analyze the, you know, where in the kind of profit equation of a farm do various technologies show up, and soil health has this kind of permanent long-term benefit to the farm that in some ways comes for free. And so, you know, it's just an incredible, I don't know, opportunity both for farmers and the rest of us. Closing thoughts. I think we're over time, so we should probably wrap it up and let the people go. Oh, you're muted. Oh no, I think our oh, now I can hear you.
I think maybe your mic went dead there.
Oh, sorry,
Adam. Okay, well, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I just would thank you again for the opportunity to be on here, and you know, look forward to continuing the work forward and towards that larger vision of you know, sustainable regenerative agriculture and carbon farming. And I think that's an exciting place for us to go to. And I think you know, we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I think there's a lot of rewards to be gained from that.
Thank you for again for presenting such a compelling vision, and I encourage everybody to join us next week. We'll be talking to Natasha Krell about smallholder farming, agriculture in Africa. Totally different topic, but just as fun. So thank you very much. And until next time.